twofold problem. So we have water conservation. We sit on one of the world's best freshwater resources, Lake Michigan. And even though it's a pretty vast resource, we still have to be conscious about using that water. It does take a lot of energy to pump it out of the lake, and then to treat it, and then to pump it to your home. And then once you use it, it runs off into the sewer a lot of times, and then we have to pump that to a treatment facility, and then pump that treated water into the river, which then flows down to the Gulf of Mexico. So if you think about it, the drain in your kitchen is kind of like one of the most complicated pumps to move water from Lake Michigan into the Gulf of Mexico. So there's a conservation issue there, energy conservation and water conservation. There's also, when we treat our water, we add chlorine to it, and there's energy involved in that as well. So that's the conservation side. And then we also have a big issue with stormwater management in Chicago. We have an old sewer system here, and it's not designed to handle the amount of rainwater that we're putting into it. As the city develops and we put in more buildings and more parking lots and more roads and sidewalks, that's all impermeable surface that rushes our rainwater straight into the gutter. And then we have to treat that water and do something with it. Or in the worst case scenarios, it actually causes our sewers to back up into people's homes. It causes it to pond in the streets, which can be a safety hazard as well as just a major inconvenience. So when you disconnect your downspout, here in Chicago, our downspouts actually go straight into the sewer systems. So most homes, you'll see them go into the concrete or into another pipe that goes underground. And that's a pretty big contributor to stormwater in the city. So when you disconnect it, you're now managing that water. Now the city sewer systems don't have to deal with that much water anymore. If you can get a whole block of people to disconnect their downspouts, there's a good chance you can start to reduce or eliminate flooding in basements and flooding in the streets. So when the water hits your roof and runs down through your downspouts, the idea of the rain barrel is essentially to capture all of that water in one point. A lot of times we get folks who will buy a rain barrel and they'll just kind of set it out in their yard, and they'll call us and say, I'm not getting as much water as I was expecting, what's the deal? And it's essentially just that they have set it out in the yard and they don't have a real source of water like this here. So when it rains, water will come pouring out of here into the barrel, and it actually can fill up rather quickly. These guys are usually 55 to 60 gallon barrels, and in a typical storm, they'll fill up at least once. Sometimes there'll be enough water to fill up 2 of them, and that's where these hoses come in. So the barrel will fill up, and as it approaches the top, the water will flow through this hose over here into this next barrel. They've got a whole chain here. I think this was just more of a demo. This building's probably too small to fill up all of them, but there's, I think, 5 of them all connected here. So once it's full, you've got your rainwater there, and they typically have a number of different fittings around them that you can attach hoses to. This one's not facing the right direction to see on your camera, but over here, this is just the standard valve, just a little on-off valve that you can hook up your garden hose to. Some people will just hook up a soaker hose, and they can turn it on and run the soaker hose into their garden or up to a tree or something like that. But that's pretty standard. These are barrels from a producer called Upcycle. They take food grade barrels, usually like olive barrels or pickles or whatever, and they just reuse them and retrofit them into these rain barrels. But we've seen hundreds of different models out there, from terracotta ones to square barrels that fit underneath the deck like this here, to really any shape you can dream of. As far as siting goes, when you install your barrel, this one's actually a much better example. These are okay over there, but generally, and this is an incomplete example here since it's not connected, but okay. Generally speaking, unless you have a huge number of barrels chained together like those over there, during a storm your barrel will overflow. There are ways to get around that using downspout diverters or other pieces of equipment, but generally speaking it'll overflow, and it'll overflow quite a bit. So you want to put your barrel somewhere where the water can get into the soil. So this site is good because there are all these plants and there's open soil and mulch, and over here is actually a bioswale that was installed specifically to manage stormwater. So this is a really ideal site for a barrel. Not that most homes have bioswales, but if you did, that would be a good place to put it. And then also the ground here, it might be hard to see, but slopes away from the building. You definitely do not want the ground to be sloping towards the building when you put in your rain barrel, because then the overflow will end up pooling up against your house, can cause some problems. So you want it to slope away, or be at the very least flat. And some people will even go so far as to plant a native plant garden around their barrel. Native plants have deep root systems. They help to usher rainwater down into the soil more quickly. So having native plants around is good for that, or even a rain garden if you want to make that kind of investment. When we say native plant, we usually mean a perennial that's deep rooted and indigenous to this area. So I am not a botanist, so I can't really identify any of these here, but like in echinacea, the purple coneflower is a good example. It has a really deep root system. Usually, like if this were a native plant, I'm not sure if it is, the roots would be at least as deep as the plant is tall, as opposed to like our turf grass or annuals, where the roots usually only go a few inches into the ground. And those deep, well-developed root systems help the ground soak up water quickly, and help keep it from pooling too long, instead of just, a lot of times our lawns function almost like impervious surfaces, because it's just this one mat of one type of plant, and there's no root system, so it just, the water all rushes right off of it. So a rain garden is basically just a depressed area. So you would basically just dig out like a little bit of a depression, or if you already had an area that's a depression, and then you plant it with different tiers of native plants that can tolerate varying degrees of moisture in the ground. So you can even see that silver downspout there is one of the only ones not connected to a giant cistern, because all that water comes over into the rain garden here. So this bermed edge helps keep the water from flowing over into the sidewalk, and then you can see down in there it's lower, it's more depressed, and that will be built with some structured soils that have more sand and gravel in them to help water percolate quickly. And then all these are all different types of native plants. So these grasses here are not as water loving as some of those flowering plants that are deeper in the depression in there. So those plants are all very tolerant of water. They can sit in swampy conditions, for a week at a time, and then when it dries out, they'll be fine in conditions like it is today.